Matteo, we are not letting you go yet. We continue today's program with a panel discussion on echo chambers as a threat to democracy. And here to discuss the topic with us are Jörg Mathes, Damian Trilling, and Matteo Sinelli, while Akim Rettinger will join us online. And the talk will be moderated by Gazela Puder-Draško. The floor is yours.
You may join me here on sort of a stage. Okay, we have been listening. So, welcome to the panel session, which is named Echo Chambers as a Threat to Democracy. And we had opportunity to listen from Matteo Cinelli in previous session about echo chambers and strong social polarization in different social media. This is very worrying issue, but there is also something which is even more worrying, that is how we direct and what is the algorithm or the mechanism which is standing behind this data on polarization which we see. And in recent documents released by whistleblower Francis Hogan, last year, there was a warning about harmful effects of algorithmic recommendation, and that is something which I would like to tackle today with you. Also, the European Union is working on additional regulations that would maybe help us to distinguish between fake news and somehow control the effects of social media. So this is something also that we need to discuss. Is it possible at all to regulate, and in which way? And also we are quite aware that this is a topic which is emerging. So this is something which is new in social sciences, and we need more research basically on what are the effects and how it is done. And I'm very pleased that we started today with one of the results of one research which is actually showing very very vividly how polarization is there and created in echo chambers. I'm very pleased today to greet 4 colleagues who are experts in this field. Today with us is Jörg Mathes, who is Professor of Communication Science at the Department of Communication at the University of Vienna. And there he also directs the Advertising Media Psychology Research Group. And his research focuses on digital media effects, advertising and consumer research, sustainability, communication, children in media, terrorism and populism, as well as different empirical methods which are serving to this purpose. Also, I'm pleased to welcome once more Damian Trilling, who is Associate Professor at the Department of Communication Science and also affiliated in Amsterdam School of Communication Research at University of Amsterdam. And currently he spends a lot of his time on the ERC-funded project News Flows, modeling news flows, how feedback loops influence citizen beliefs and shape democracy. So very, very interesting, I would say, project. And we have online with us Achim Rettinger, full professor at Trier University in Germany. He's leading the research group on knowledge representational learning that sees the holy grail of human-centered artificial intelligence in the machine learning and expressive knowledge representation. And finally, our guest, which you already had opportunity to listen in previous minutes, Matteo Cinelli, a research fellow in computer science at University of Rome La Sapienza. And he is dealing with the social networks, data science, computational social science, and big data analytics. And he's also active member of Complex Systems Society. So welcome to our forum on AI-driven humanity, and especially to this session when we are going to discuss a little bit more about echo chambers. So I will start with Jörg. You have published numerous books and research papers that have addressed the psychological aspects of advertising and communication. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about relationship between emotion and cognition in social media and social consequences of these processes that obviously can turn into echo chambers?
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Yeah, there's a cognitive side and an emotional side to phenomena like echo chambers. On the cognitive side, these are processes which are actually well known in psychology, that people strive for consistency, that we have to cope with our environments, our information environments. We would like to have a homogeneous, consistent information environment in order to cope with the world. This is something that has been there before. So, and it's not necessarily bad. However, there are also biases in how we process information. For instance, when we are avoiding certain kinds of information, but that's only one thing. Selective exposure is only one thing. But also if we processing the same information in a different manner. So in the echo chambers debate, we have this idea that, well, as long as we give people different sides to an issue, then we are all fine in democracy. From a psychological perspective, that's not necessarily the case. Because how we process information, even if it's two-sided and if it's totally neutral, kind of depend on our involvement, on our emotional and cognitive involvement with issues. So it's a little bit, would be too easy to say, well, if there was no echo chamber, there's no polarization. I don't think that's necessarily the case. And also technology is not the only factor in driving polarization. It's also how we discuss issues, how we treat several groups in a society, how politicians communicate, how journalists pick up information and frame their stories. All of this contributes to these phenomena. And also, on top of it, as you mentioned, the effective side. So if it doesn't help in a debate, like for instance in the COVID-19 debate, if one side is disregarded and also treated as someone who is illiterate, stupid, uninformed, and so on and so forth. This leads to further emotional polarization, which will then accelerate biased processing of information. That's not only selective exposure or avoidance, that's also counter-arguing, that's source degradation. These are other psychological processes that go on that kind of accelerate or lead to an increased polarization in society. So on the psychological level, I think the processes are much more far-reaching than when we only take technology. So because it would be too short-sighted to think that just if we provide everybody with two sides, we will all be very tolerant and we'll all understand the information in similar ways. We won't.
Thank you very much. We are going to open discussion very briefly after 2 rounds of questions, and I would like to continue with Damian. You have made lots of insightful inquiries into the spread of attitudes, information flow in political communication, and obviously we perceive this as a threat to democracy. And what do you think? I mean, is it really a threat, and who is to be held accountable? I mean, can we at all held accountable algorithms, or there are people who are standing behind these algorithms who actually are accountable?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm actually not sure whether this works. Yeah, I think I did. But, okay. Oh, sorry. I actually switched it off. So, thanks a lot for your question. So I guess that I would like to start by actually referring back to something that Matteo said at the very end of your presentation, because you said that when you talked about echo chambers, you were essentially empirically investigating whether people talk to each other, not so much exposure to content, also because of course it's much more difficult to measure and so on. But I think if we talk about echo chambers, that can make quite some difference. And I would like to talk a bit more about the exposure side of it. So not so much about whether people engage in a healthy debate, but more about, do people actually still see the other side? And that's something where I actually see less evidence for, if we want to call it an echo chamber, because I think that in some platforms like Gab or so aside, probably people will see at least some part of the rest. So what I do think is a danger for democracy is not so much that we really have large parts of the population who are not aware of the other side. I do think most people are, but I think, and I actually also do think that polarization and radicalization are problems. But I would like to maybe emphasize one part that is maybe sometimes a bit less regarded, and that is that these kind of, well, biased representations of how prevalent an opinion is, that can lead to interesting downstream effects. So for instance, if you basically, because of your network on some social media platform, basically think that a lot of people are of your opinion, even though they are actually a minority, that may actually change the way how you act also beyond that. For instance, there's a quite convincing argument to be made that if you have a very small radical minority, if they stay in that circle, maybe that's something that happened in all times. I think something like that has been said before. But if you actually think that you are actually representing the majority, that actually a lot of people think like you may get self-confidence, you may actually then reach out, you may actually try to convert people into that. And I think that is some very interesting process. And about the accountability thing that you asked, like, is it an algorithm, is it a human? I think that it is always interaction. So I don't think there's a X leads to Y accountability thing. It's not that there's this one mighty algorithm that completely blocks you off. It would also be probably, even from a business perspective, often not work. I mean, you probably have a wrong idea of how some recommendation system works if you think that it would only want to reinforce this kind of silos. Of course, that can happen as a side effect, but I think for democracy, yeah. And I mean, I'm not a historian, and I know it's always very difficult and very dangerous to make historical comparisons, but I do think we have a lot of examples, also in this region, if I may say, in the past where there was a lot of radicalization without the internet. So I think, well, we shouldn't blame technology only. Thanks.
Thank you. Matteo, you have presented a lot of your findings now. I wanted to ask you what are the main, maybe the most interesting thing for you from your perspective into everything which you already presented, and also to ask you, we had as a guest recently the colleague from Italy, philosopher Maurizio Ferraris, who got our award for critical engagement, and he wrote a book about stupidity, and he actually claims that the social platforms which we have are now just revealing what humans are in general, so that we have a lot of people who are not able to, let's say, their cognitive capacities are not sufficient in order to be able to accommodate different varieties of information which they get today, because there is a lot of different information which we get every day. And this is like a platform where they can come, and discuss things which obviously are not true, obviously, so in some cases. And you presented that if they are like banned from some platform here, they move to another, they build another platform actually. So are we somehow doomed to face all this and not be able to do anything about it?
Well, thanks for the question. It's quite broad. So for what concerns my findings, I think that the evidence that we found in the data for, let's say, this kind of segregation online is the interesting thing. And actually trying to measure it with more accuracy, more properly, including the role of emotions and sentiment and toxicity is kind of the next challenge that we should address. I don't really like the idea of telling that people that consume, I don't know, misinformation or anti-vax stuff are stupid. I'm really against this. There are, I guess, deeper reasons for which a certain person decide to interact with anti-vax information, for instance, that are beyond the overwhelming let's say, cascade of information that we are exposed to. I guess most of the time is justifying a fear or just looking for stuff that fits your narrative in some sense. The fact that people migrate to other social media is also because, for sure we retrieve information from social media, but if you look at my YouTube timeline, it's mostly not about news and not about politics. So I guess very few of us spend most of our times looking news on social media. We actually stay there because we want to spend some time looking at funny stuff. Engagement with memes is incredible. If you see one of the most famous platforms now is TikTok, where political engagement, not so much. So the thing is that for sure the concept of democracy, exposure to vast amount of, let's say, homogeneous information would be better, but this is not the main thing on social media. I guess also Facebook recently was dropping a project related to news because actually the consumption of news was not so relevant compared to the rest of the things. So the fact of migrating is just perhaps saying, there is a self-selection bias. I mean, if you migrate to a different platform, it means that you kind of are really prone to go there. But also, the main idea of this platform is hiding behind the idea of free speech and the fact that social media platforms like mainstream one are not really pro free speech and providing a safe space, but it's actually the risk is to further polarizing people and especially exposing people to very problematic content, especially violence.
Thanks a lot. Akim, do you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Thank you. Well, it looks like Knowledge Representation Learning Research Group maybe sees things in a bit more positive way. Can you tell us, do you see human-centered artificial intelligence in machine learning as an opportunity or threat in the domain of echo chambers formation and its impact on democracy today?
Yeah, thank you for the question and thank you for inviting me. So this is maybe not a community that I'm usually at. So as you just pointed out, my background is actually in machine learning and computer science, and I just moved recently into this area. So I can not really say any, let's say, well-funded comments on this, only just intuitive maybe explanations. So since you could consider me as a person who developed such algorithms like content selection algorithms, but always from a different perspective. So never thinking about the outcome of this. So coming back to the question, if I see this more positive, let's say I used to, up to a couple of years ago, or at least I didn't think that much about it. But nowadays, I would say I see it very critical. So maybe mostly as a threat, but also as an opportunity. So being, let's say, a German, and I have to talk about the threats more, more prominently. I see them more prominently, and I also guess. So, I mean, AI is always a dual use technology. You can always decide to use it for a specific target, right? That can harm or that can bring some benefit. So, and I also believe that it is a very, very, it is just getting started. So with those new large language models like ChatGPT has been mentioned, I think this will get more and more problematic, specifically on the content side. So the content will get much more AI driven, and this will have unknown effects right now. So maybe what I can contribute is how I see the level or different types or levels of threats that come from the AI algorithms. And maybe, yeah, there may be external ones and internal ones, right? There's the ones that users of platforms, like actors, can impose by using AI, let's say by automatically generated content, by spam, by fake news, by bots, all this stuff. But let's not talk about this. Right now, let's talk about more the internal mechanisms. This was what the discussion was mostly about so far. So, and there I see something like 3 different types of threats. So the one is there a threat by using AI methods to intentionally change how content is distributed on those platforms? So intentionally with some kind of intent to, let's say, censor, filter, rank in a certain way. And this is, of course, very much present in authoritarian societies, right? So there, this kind of, the government controls basically what's allowed and what's not. But I think this is also true, or becomes more and more apparent that this is a risk for private tech companies. So now Elon Musk taking over Twitter, we have some kind of indications that hate speech went up. The journalists are going to be banned from the platform. So I think this is also something that's very risky. So, but this is maybe also something that I cannot talk about that much. What's more interesting is maybe from my perspective is the non-intentional effects of using AI on social media. And this is something that's more like, you can see the creation of echo chambers as a side effect. And because they are actually not optimized for whatever, creating or not creating echo chambers or polarization, they are more driven by economic profit motives. So so they are optimized for, you know, user engagement, attention. So this is kind of the stuff that we optimized our recommendation systems for. And so this is the interesting question, if this kind of as a side effect leads to more engaging, more extreme, more simplifying, less nuanced, less complex, less plural content, whatever you want to call this. I don't have an answer for that. I just say we know how to optimize the content and the ranking and the filtering very much to increase user engagement and attention. We don't know very much about, or I haven't researched much about, seen research about how you have those negative side effects, or maybe they're even positive. I don't know. And then there's maybe the third level, and this is kind of using AI in general. So this morning we started with the Matrix, so that's not what I'm talking about. So I'm not assuming that whatever the AI algorithms on the platforms at a certain point say, okay, I'm sick of this, I'm taking over, I start my own agenda, and I will whatever, erase all humans or something like this. But there's already a very real threat by just the complexity and black box nature of AI algorithms that are running on those platforms. So I'm pretty sure that even the technicians and AI engineers at the big platforms really know what their ranking algorithms are doing anymore, because they're machine learning based and they cannot say what they've learned. And we have seen a lot of anecdotal, at least, evidence for what this can mean, right? We have this kind of the machine learning algorithms tend to learn all the biases or repeat all the biases that are already there in society. So be it whatever, gender, race, all the stuff is also there in the AI algorithms. And they also show quite an erratic behavior. So let's say, I mean, this is now going probably a bit further, but I think it has some influence also on something like echo chambers. You have an effect that is driven by, let's say, automated behavior of AI systems. So you can have like AI-driven trends where, I mean, this has mostly been observed in, let's say, automated trading of stocks, right? Where you have some effects where billions or millions of dollars are lost because there was some news that then certainly spread, and automated trading algorithms picked up on it and sold a lot of stocks or something like this. So I think this is something that's often not kept in mind when we talk about the use of AI algorithms, right? And I think that it has some implications on social networks as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So
we need now to move on in order to be able to accommodate a few questions. I would just ask you all now, since, I mean, you have spoken about different aspects and mostly, I mean, negative aspects of what is happening on these platforms. Is it at all possible to regulate it, and how? So is it European Union, as I mentioned, is trying to do something, but can you do it like if there is some global alliance which is actually which could bring some let's say control or try to do something, and especially if as Akim said, there is a machine-based learning process of artificial intelligence. So is it possible at all to interfere into this and regulate it? So just a question for all of you.
Should I start? Yeah, thank you. Before going to the regulating point, just one brief comment. What you mentioned about this notion that most people are actually stupid. And I think this is a very problematic notion that we increasingly see when it comes to AI and technology and social media. And you basically treat humans as children. You say, well, you know, you can't really know and you're not able to understand, so I better I make sure you're not exposed to this kind of content. That's what you typically do for your own children. Say, oh, you should not see this, you should not do this. Later on you will understand, but I make the decision for you. And I think that's problematic, because if I don't give people the possibility to learn, and I don't give my children the possibility to learn, if I only forbid and also censor, you will not be competent. You cannot develop competence. So this notion, although I understand its origin, is dangerous because it basically leads to an elite mass gap, where one side says this is right and this is wrong, and this is accurate and this is not accurate, and you can't know and you will not understand, so therefore I will do this on your behalf. I think that's it's a potentially problematic notion, because we as humans, we fundamentally have the right to understand the world as we see it. That's one of the to learn about our environments. That's one of the most important things that human history has brought upon us. That we are not told by religion or others what the world is like, and this should not be questioned. So it's a very fundamental issue. Regulating, is it possible to regulate? I mean, first of all, I think there is, of course, a need to regulate. So this time and area of enthusiasm about technology, where we say, well, let's just be it out there and it will work by itself, and and it will be beneficial. This time is over. So now, of course, regulation is important. We have the misinformation problem. We have the hate problem. We have illegal content. All these things, especially illegal content, makes this discussion very necessary. So this is very important. However, the question remains: how transparent is the regulation? Who regulates actually? How transparent are the processes behind that? Who decides? And also, if you have a regulation in place, how accurate is it? How accurately can you really differentiate? And we have this also in academia. We have this very simple notion of this is disinformation and this is truth. And sometimes I wonder, isn't that also far too simple? We are living in contested times, and also how we see our world as contested. It's very difficult to say in the anti-vaccination debate, this is actually false. Some of the stuff that was false 2 years ago now actually turns out to be a little bit more true. So we have to be careful with the simple distinction between disinformation or misinformation on the one hand and truth on the other hand, because this also leads to can lead to spiraling processes, which at the end of the day are dangerous for our democracy. So yes, there is a need for regulation, and it's very important to do so. But regulation can't mean we decide on one point what is right and what is wrong, and then the debate is over. It's a continuous process, and it needs to be transparent. And we don't need to. And I think we should be careful in our beliefs about the accuracy of what we are doing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So also think it's related to what Jörg said. It's a very delicate and difficult topic, and I would like to underline this need to go beyond the black and white thing. So I've had a lot of conversations, for instance, with people from the Department of Information Law, which is well in the same building as where we are. And we had a lot of discussions on, for instance, the effects of the European General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, and also on coming AI regulations or so, where very often I found myself in a position that I thought like, well, in principle, I agree with you, but actually, if you take it literally, it would mean that, for instance, a lot of social science research even would be kind of illegal. When people say, well, you know what, we should really forbid that we use some kind of predictive algorithm related to, say, sex and gender and age or whatever. And then suddenly, then you say, yeah, you know what? So actually for decades, we run regression models where we use these variables to understand, for instance, political interest and things like that. So we don't call it AI or something, but if I just literally look at what you wrote, then you're basically saying what I do is immoral or should be illegal or things like that. And I find it, and I also see, of course, the very difference between that and having something like the examples we talked yesterday about, where maybe you would really discriminate against people if you roll something out or like that on a larger scale, which is a very different thing. But I think we need to be very careful to not overshoot the target by basically from the perspective that we basically have some specific bad examples in mind, like what is happening on specific social media platforms with specific technologies at this specific point in time, and then try to extrapolate from that and then say like, okay, so this needs to be fixed right now. And then we come up with some solution that maybe is then valid for decades, but that actually does not reflect how we maybe use technologies or which technologies actually will change in the next decade. So yes, I agree we should regulate. I also think that in contrast what sometimes said, it is actually at least partly possible. We saw it, for instance, that when things like the GDPR came, which essentially, well, the European Union did that, but now also if you're in the US, you can basically download your own takeout data from Google because it was then simpler for them to just implement it for everyone. So there are things that work even on a global scale, and we then would have to discuss who actually has the right to regulate and all of that. So I'm not pessimistic that's not possible, but I think we underestimate how difficult it is to not have, also like related to what Achim said, have unintended side consequences of that. I think that's something we really need to discuss.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. I mean, I was pretty interested by this thing that truth and falsehood shouldn't be distinguished. I mean, in this kind of black and white fashion. And I guess this is relevant also for regulation in some sense. Perhaps we should be more focused about what can be harmful. And we have seen this, for instance, during the COVID-19 infodemic, where, okay, if you say to someone that drinking bleach might cure COVID, well, this is false, okay, but this is also harmful. And I guess that, fighting against this kind of stuff is kind of important. About regulation, I guess this is a self-adapting system that goes much faster than regulators could do. So I guess there are always new way out to avoid essentially some sort of regulation. There are some things that can be do for good, like having access to your own data. But how many people actually know how to download, store, process, eventually share the data that they have? I guess raising awareness about the fact that perhaps it's common sense, and in this case, I'm sorry for this, but the fact that we are using services essentially for free in terms of economic cost, not in terms of social cost, something that people should know. So Google, you're using a great service and you're not paying. So the fact that there should be a cost somewhere. And I guess that beyond regulation, there should be a parallel effort in terms of, raising awareness about all these things, what you can do. And so maybe people would think more about viable solution, more, let's say, bottom up. I think this would be very useful, because then people would talk about their necessities and what they feel. I mean, if they, let's say, are unhappy about, some behaviors that platforms are pushing.
Thanks a lot. Akim?
Yeah, so I guess most of the important points have already been made, so I can just weigh down on some of them a little bit. So I also totally agree that this binary classification of a lot of those, like, is it fake or not? Is the polarity like this? Is the sentiment positive or negative? Actually is much too simplified. And specifically, this comes from actually my community, like natural language processing. They always like to have something like binary optimization targets, and this simplifies very much. But this also translates to the regularization. So I'm totally not an expert in this area, but all the stuff that I've read, I always had to think about how do you. So if you make a statement, whatever, the content shouldn't be toxic and shouldn't harm. I don't know. How do you measure this? This is impossible. I mean, how do you put a number on this or something like this? This is, maybe it's not impossible, but we are far from doing this in a proper way. So maybe to not to be too critical and put some ideas out there, and opportunities is maybe something that has also been mentioned. So removing something like the profit motive could do some of the job already. And we maybe have to understand a little bit better what makes a discussion constructive, right? What makes a discussion tick in a way that you accept opinions from other people and really think about them. But how then incorporate this into something like the platform mechanics and kind of enforce this? I don't know yet, but maybe AI can help by doing this. But yeah.
Thanks a lot. I think that I could maybe, based on what you said, conclude that it's very important to understand. So the more research is definitely something which is needed, that we can understand, and based on this understanding, maybe can act in some way. And on the other side, it's very important to work on media literacy of the population in general. And I know that even many of my colleagues who consider themselves quite literate in these terms make quite basic mistakes sometimes. So I think this is something which we really need to take forward and send as a message from this forum. I would now like to open the floor for just few questions. If you want to ask, please, now it's the moment. So yes, there is one hand raised, and if somebody else wants, we will collect 2 or 3 questions and then give a chance to panelists to respond.
Can you hear me? Yeah, thanks. Well, we usually think either of technology or people in general when we talk about these topics, especially echo chambers and polarization of opinion. But I would like to stress the responsibility of the media in general as an industry in creating this environment or this communication space where extreme opinion counts. So if you look at the if we think about the attention economy within this highly commercialized and profit-oriented space, then controversy is something that is really a strategy, a very useful and very common strategy of the media industry. So it somehow legitimizes the atypical, something that is not something that is extreme in one sense. And then if you think about the journalist codes of conduct, the way they translate balance is usually black and white, very simplified. So it's, I think that this contributes and legitimizes extreme opinions and extreme positions as well. So I think that we have to look at changes within the media industry as well. Thanks.
Is there anyone else? Yeah. One more.
I have one question that is concerning a new media that emerges recently, Mastodon. So how existence of Mastodon and its structure can influence echo chambers and in terms of democracy, because it's structured as a rhizomatic kind of way with all those servers, so they can serve as the echo chamber on their own. So how that can influence democracy?
Thank you for the question. So if there are no more questions, we can return to Damian.
I can take the Mastodon one.
Yes.
I created an account there myself like a year ago, and then actually I clicked on the activation link and never did anything else. And then suddenly, of course, everyone switched and they said, oh, actually, that was this thing that I thought back then was pretty cool, but didn't really do it because, of course, there's this network effect that if no one else is there, there's no fun. Yeah. But I think you are very right in the sense that we should think about what that means in terms of opinion polarization and so on, that we have this very different thing. I think there are actually 2 counteracting forces here. So the one thing is that, as you said, you have this federated structure of different servers, and you could say that if someone indeed uses this new local function, where you basically can click on local and you get to see things from your own server, that might actually reinforce such things. At the same time, most servers are like within the same federation, right? So it's you could technically speaking block a different server, but I think it's not happening on a large scale. But what is the counteracting force is that Mastodon, at least in the current implementation, and of course, because it's open source, you could change it. You can make a pull request and or change the source code and run your own instance. But right now, it is not that we have an algorithmic recommendation logic like the one in Twitter that is indeed about boosting engagement and with, as Achim said, might have an undesired side effect of reinforcing echo chambers. So we don't have that here. So as an answer to your question, I would say, like, yes, in principle, the the fact that we have this distinction between local and global here might actually be pro more echo chamber, while at the same time I think that we are back to essentially a chronological timeline is actually against the echo chamber thing. So I think that probably it is actually leading to less echo chambers if more people would actually move there, because right now, of course, it's a very select community, while Twitter was maybe much more diverse to start with, because now it's all these academics and people who are critical of Twitter moved there. But once everyone moves there, I'm actually relatively optimistic, I have to say. But in the end, I think it is also like related to some points that Matteo was making. In the end, it's a complex system where it's hard to blame one feature or the other. But yeah, it's a very interesting development, and I'm actually very much looking forward to studying it more. Yeah.
Wonderful. To briefly follow up on this, I mean, I had a similar thought. I mean, typically we discuss echo chambers within the platform. This is what most of our research dealt with. But now what we see with Mastodon and with Truth Social, we see that there are different platforms. And when you look at the debate and how politicized the debate is, also polarized, that people say you have to go to Mastodon, you have to leave Twitter because of that and that, that you actually see that different political camps are moving to different platforms. That's an entirely new dimension we are potentially, I'm not sure, but potentially facing when it comes to the echo chamber debate, because if the by and large Western left-wing academics, by and large left-wing, move to a different platform and others move to other platforms, then we don't even have the possibility to see a content, even on a minor scale, and we really will be disaggregated. And that's potentially problematic. And we as academics sometimes contribute to this also because academia is getting more and more, in my opinion, in my reading, more and more political. With the notion that in many Western countries, academics understand themselves as activists in the social sciences and rightfully make this argument. But then, of course, it's very difficult to it's very difficult to have some distance to your field of study. And if we are all activists ourselves, then what's the difference of a scientist than to an ordinary activist? So I'm a little bit skeptical here, and the Mastodon Twitter debate, also in academia, is a little bit driven by that, in my opinion.
Well, thank you very much. I myself didn't want to move to Mastodon just because I wanted to follow different opinions, and the notion of having different server really told me somehow, at least I thought that it is not possible. It's creating immediately chambers. So that was some, let's say, like thinking behind the usage of media, social media. Thank you very much for joining us for this session. I think we tackled some very important issues here. We are continuing with our program. We have now a short break and we started 11 sharp. Thank you.
Thank you.